Grace and peace, y'all. It's good to be with you. I'm recording this in my home in Asheville, North Carolina, in the southern part of the Appalachian Mountains. And I'm really grateful that in the midst of this time when we're experiencing so much disconnection and separation, that we're also leaning into these other ways of connecting with each other. And so I'm finding myself connecting with friends around the globe, and it's good this morning to be in worship with you. So thank you, Steve, for inviting me to be here. Our text this morning comes from the 24th chapter of Luke. It's the Emmaus story, a familiar story to many of us. So hear these words again. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him." And then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." And so then they told him what had happened to them on the road, and how he had been made known to them and the breaking of the bread. So our story begins with two followers of Jesus on the road, presumably heading home 3 days after Jesus was executed. We don't know a whole lot about these two. One is named Cleopas and the other is not either named or gendered. We know at this point in the story the 11 remaining disciples are hunkered down with some others that were close to Jesus' inner circle. They're in hiding, scared and confused. We also know that Cleopas thinks of himself as central enough to the group that when he refers to the women who first bore witness to those angels, to the empty tomb, the ones who were not believed and to whom he's not even sure of, he speaks to them as our women of our group. So he's at least somewhat of an insider, in the know enough to know where the others are hiding, a part of the circle enough to call the community his own. So here's my question. Why are these two not with the others? Why have these two left or been sent away? My first thought is that they were afraid and so decided to return home, and that makes sense enough. I can imagine that if I was identifiable as a part of Jesus' inner circle, that I might want to put some distance between me and Jerusalem. But their behavior doesn't seem to support this idea very much. I mean, if I was trying to distance myself from persecution at the hands of the empire because of my association with a recently executed man believed to be a threat to the powers, I don't think the first conversation I had with a stranger on the road would be to identify myself with that man. Cleopas and his companions seem confused and grief-stricken, but not afraid, or at least if they are afraid, they aren't showing it. They're leading with their vulnerability. Cleopas makes it really clear that they were part of Jesus' community. So we'll never know for sure why they were on the road away from Jerusalem, but given the lack of information, we have some room to wonder. I think a case could be made, given what we know and what we don't, that maybe these two were sent home. Who knows why? Maybe Cleopas talks a bit too much, or maybe he was too quick to believe the women, or maybe, just maybe, these two, Cleopas and his nameless, genderless friend, somehow fell short of whatever standard the 11 set to determine who got to stay with the core community. Knowing that we cannot know the reason why, let's try on the idea that Cleopas and his friend were not just travelers on the road to Emmaus, but instead two of Jesus' followers who were, for some reason, sent away from their community. In the midst of grief and confusion, imagine these two as also experiencing rejection. What if we read the story through the lens of two who loved Jesus and longed to be part of that community, but were sent packing? If we begin with this image of the Emmaus travelers as those marginalized from the center of the Jesus movement, the ones sent on their way as soon as Jesus wasn't there to make sure that they were still included, this familiar story might have something new to teach us. So today, let's read the Emmaus story from low and outside, honoring all those who were sent away, people and congregations that were sent away from the centers of church power. This is for the heretics, the prophets, the annoying truth speakers, the women preachers, the colonized reclaimers, the divorcees, the reformers, and the queers. Cleopas's friend is a blank slate, so take a moment and imagine who he's walking with. Who is a bit too much for Peter and friends' view of those that counted enough to seek shelter with one another? Who is it that you know that's been sent away? Or was it you? Are you Cleopas's friend? I imagine I'm not the only one that feels some resonance with being sent away. I know the sting and fear and confusion and grief of not making the cut for those who were deemed important enough to be the inner circle. It also seems important here to note that some of those allowed to stay, particularly the women, including those to whom Jesus first showed up, who first saw the empty tomb and heard the words of those angels, they were still rendered invisible or suspect by the core group that come Pentecost would become the church. Let's imagine Cleopas and his friend, whoever you imagine that friend to be, on their way home. They had hoped. They'd hoped that Jesus might be the one to redeem Israel. They had hoped that they may have found a place among his followers. They had hoped for some sense of hope, of sustaining and ongoing hope and security. They had hoped. But instead, they found themselves on the road to Emmaus, sad and disillusioned. They were attentive to a stranger who suggests that maybe this Jesus is the Savior after all, but perhaps their most faithful act is that they extend that stranger hospitality, inviting him to spend the night once they've reached Emmaus. The ones who were sent away are the ones who opened their homes. I don't know about y'all, but my encounters with folk who have been cast out by religious authorities almost invariably have these markings. There may be sadness and a sense of betrayal, but right alongside of that has been a sense of welcome that's deep and sincere, with all the pretense of churchiness gone. Might it be hard to recognize Jesus in your midst when you've been sent away? Certainly, at first. Jesus may not look like who you'd expected in that moment, but like in this story, Jesus continues to walk alongside as companion and teacher. So he goes in to stay with them, receives their hospitality, and in the breaking of the bread, a clear Eucharistic reference to the Seder just 4 days earlier, They see him. Jesus is known in the breaking of the bread. This is the focal point for most of our readings of the story. But let's take a second here to note Jesus' first couple of appearances are to women who are not to be believed, and then to these two. I mean, the first witnesses of the resurrection. So, the ones who we can imagine were sent away are the ones that Jesus shows up to face first. Jesus doesn't first come to the center of power among his own followers. He recognizes that it's those out on the edges who have eyes to see. It took them a minute to understand what's happening, but Cleopas and his friend were able to see Jesus not in the center of the emerging church, but on the fringe of it. There's a clarity that comes in the despair of being cast out, an awareness, perhaps, of holiness, of everything, of sacred encounters in and with the stranger. As Leonard Cohen suggests, there's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. And as my friend Nancy Sehested reminds us, it's also where the light gets out. Those people cracked open enough to see beyond their fear are the ones to whom Jesus shows his face first, and their faces are the first faces Jesus sees upon his return. Perhaps we know these folks. Perhaps we've been these folks, the ones who lost the Jesus they thought they knew and who found themselves sent away and then encountered Jesus again in powerful and unexpected ways. So what do? Those that have seen Jesus, they turn around and they head back to Jerusalem and are imagining today back to the very ones who sent them away, and they bear witness to the resurrected Christ. It is true, the Lord has risen. Having experienced God's imminent presence in breaking bread with a stranger after being sent away from Jerusalem, they go back, they share the good news. Now let's be clear. I'm not at all suggesting that those abused by systems of religiosity submit ourselves back to those systems for more abuse. I am suggesting, however, that we continue to proclaim the good news of the resurrection, even and perhaps especially in earshot of those within the tradition who cannot see, who are so huddled in fear that they're missing Jesus showing up, walking along beside them. Those who haven't had the experience of breaking bread with the stranger out on the margins. Those of us who have walked the road to Emmaus are still called back to Jerusalem, perhaps speaking truth to power. But here's the tricky part. It's easy and comforting for me to see myself in Cleopas, or to see myself as Cleopas's friend. I love thinking of the unnamed companion and his same-gendered partner as them being a little too unabashed about their love for each other. That's the spin that I put on this story. It's my story, so it's no surprise that when I'm imagining, that's where my imagination goes. But I'm also just as much those disciples hunkered down and hiding out in Jerusalem. The ones who doubted the women. The ones who sent away or at least failed to welcome Cleopas and his friends. The ones who want to believe in resurrection, but it seems a bit too far-fetched. I am Cleopas's friend, but I'm also the scared disciple. Aren't we all?